Good afternoon and welcome. We're going to give it about 2 minutes to give people a chance to log on and get settled before we get started. We're glad you're here with us today. We're going to give it about 1 more minute before we get started. Welcome to everybody who has joined us. We're going to give everybody a chance to get on and get settled, and then we'll get started in about 60 seconds. All right, it is 2 minutes after the hour. We'll go ahead and kick off today's webinar. Good afternoon again and welcome. My name is Lucy Barrier and I'm a policy analyst here at the Hunt Institute. I'm going to go over a couple of logistical remarks before we jump into discussion, including that today's conversation will include an audience Q&A. That will be run entirely through the Q&A feature in Zoom. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see it says Q&A and you can type your questions in there at any point throughout the webinar. We will have a dedicated audience Q&A portion at the kind of the second half of today's conversation, but you can submit your questions at any time. Additionally, if you would like to follow along with the conversation on Twitter, we will be live tweeting with the hashtag race and education from our account at Hunt_Institute, and we would love for you to join us there as well. And I am now pleased to introduce our speakers for today. For today's conversation around the intersection of anti-Black racism and adolescent development, we have Dr. Joanna Lee Williams, who is the co-director of the National Scientific Council on Adolescence, Rodney Robinson, who is a senior advisor for Richmond Public Schools in Virginia and who was the 2019 National Teacher of the Year, Kofi Mason, who is a student at Albemarle High School, and our moderator is Lisa Hamilton, who is the president and CEO of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Before we jump in, I would like to introduce our Director of Equity Initiatives, Ashley Canty, who will be providing some opening remarks on behalf of the Hunt Institute. Ashley, over to you.
I am muted. Thanks, Lucy. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation on the impact of anti-Black racism on adolescent development. I first want to thank our panelists for making the time to be here with us. They are doing crucial work, and I'm looking forward to learning and hearing more about their experiences. Racism, particularly anti-Black racism, has been highlighted recently as we contend with the role that institutions have played in perpetuating systemic discrimination and bias against communities of color. We know that schools and other education spaces are not exempt from this conversation. Anti-Black racism plays out on a micro and macro level in classrooms across the country every day. We also know that systemic bias impacts educational performance. Psychologists have found that even passing reminders that a student belongs to a demographic that is traditionally stereotyped as being less academically successful, including girls and Black students, leads to lower test scores. This, of course, has implications for how we consider achievement gaps and implement strategies to close them. The phenomenon is closely related to the focus of today's conversation, how anti-Black racism impacts the identity formation and belonging and increase in agency and exploration that take place during adolescence. Adolescence is a particularly valuable time in a child's life, causing urgency around understanding this impact, but also opportunity for instead creating positive and supportive environments that mitigate the impact of interpersonal and structural racism. I would like to thank the Center for the Developing Adolescent for partnering with us on this webinar and urge you to check out their work and research. Thank you again to all of you for being here, and I'm excited to jump into the conversation. Lisa, I'm pleased to turn it over to you to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley, and it is a pleasure to be here with you and with our panelists today. I'm going to provide a few framing comments about our topic today, building on what you've shared, Ashley, and then jump into some questions with our panelists. You know, the past year and a half, our nation has weathered economic and health crises that have exposed racial inequities that have undermined young people, families, and communities of color for generations. At the same time, we're experiencing a national reckoning on race as more Americans have protested police brutality and the horrifying deaths of Black men, women, and children at the hands of officers who were called to protect and serve. These challenges of poverty, discrimination, and bias play out in schools as they do across the country, whether it's disproportionate responses to student behavior or a lack of diversity in staff and curriculum. These issues harm students of color and can jeopardize their future. This is a failure of the system. And we should all want all of our students to succeed regardless of the color of their skin, because it benefits not only them as individuals and their families and communities, but all of us as a nation. So if we want all kids in this country to succeed and thrive, we can't ignore the trauma and negative impact that racism has on youth of color as they are on the road to adulthood. And we can't ignore, as Ashley said, how those experiences can damage their sense of self and their sense of belonging. And so the focus of our conversations today is on this recent report from the Center for the Developing Adolescent, which highlights the ways that racist practices and policies in schools clash with what we know about healthy adolescent behavior. But the good news is that the report notes serious challenges young people might face, but that the very nature of adolescence provides opportunities to address their trauma and the negative experiences they might have. And so we are looking forward to exploring all that this report has to say about the challenges, but both the opportunities for young people. I'm thrilled we have a panel today that includes a researcher, a practitioner, a teacher, and a young person who can, I know, bring lots of different perspectives to this conversation. So we're going to jump right in and start with you, Joanna, as a researcher on these issues. Can you tell us more about the findings presented in this report? Adolescence always gets a bad rap, but there's a lot of important development going on during this time. Talk to us about what the report tells us about adolescence and sort of this intersection with anti-Black racism.
Sure. First, let me thank the Hunt Institute for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to get to share the official first report of the National Scientific Council on Adolescence. I also want to acknowledge that the funders for Adolescent Science Translation, which includes the Annie E. Casey Foundation, helped to support our work. And I want to acknowledge my co-panelists. Kofi Mason actually contributed to the report, giving us some feedback as we were drafting the work and giving us feedback on, the first few drafts of the process. So they were an important contributor. And I'm honored to be on a panel with one of our teachers of the year. So let me jump in by talking a little bit about how we framed the report and why we focus specifically on Black adolescents. And I think, Lisa, some of your comments really sort of dig into our intentional framing. When I say Black adolescents or Black youth, of course, I am talking about a richly diverse group of young people. There's no one singular experience of being Black. But at the same time, the context of anti-Black racism and race-based inequities in some ways do create a shared context or a shared set of experiences among Black youth. That often necessitates learning how to cope with discrimination and other race-related stressors. And we see that showing up when we start to aggregate up to the group level. Lisa, as you mentioned, focusing on Black youth mirrors, where we are in our national reckoning with race. Our current attention to systemic anti-Black racism and related injustices that have been, sort of at the forefront of national conversations, have been contested and wrestled with over the past year and a half, perhaps more deeply than they have in the past, several years. And importantly, our council is the National Scientific Council on Adolescence. So we really draw from the existing science. And in thinking about research done on the impacts of racism in adolescence, a lot of that research, frankly, is focused on Black youth. So the best science we have available centers the experiences of Black youth. So for us, it was important to start there. The other kind of important, I think, take-home message or important starting message for our report is that the science supporting the existence of and the negative impacts of interpersonal racism, structural racism, and anti-Blackness is irrefutably clear. We know, and we've known for a long time, that racism negatively impacts many aspects of healthy development, from mental health to self-esteem to academic outcomes. These forms of racism result in reduced access to resources. It helps our society to normalize and accept racist behavior. And it decreases support for positive development of Black youth within the many contexts that they experience in their lives, schools, communities, and other institutions. And, at a societal level, racism impacts and limits academic growth, and it undermines our ability to live up to our full potential. So I think those are important grounding pieces for our report. Our goal with our focus on adolescence is to really then examine, what do we know about the period of adolescence? And how then do experiences with anti-Black racism or anti-Black racism as a context come into contact with these central developmental processes? So very briefly, we highlight two key areas of adolescent development. The first is identity formation and belonging. Adolescence is a critical time for youth to start really kind of digging into and reflecting on questions about who am I, who do I want to be, how do other people see me, what is my position in the world? And they also look to have a strong sense of belonging to peer groups, to the institutions where they spend their time, in their family contexts. So those are critical and normative aspects that are important for all adolescents. The other important area of adolescent development is it's a time when youth need to be afforded with opportunities for agency, so exerting a sense of agency and control over their own lives, as well as to explore, to try new things. Adolescence is a really critical time for exploration and discovery. And so with those kind of central developmental processes as a starting place, we can then start to understand how, if you are developing your sense of who you are and coming into contact regularly with, anti-Black racism, either interpersonally or, at the level of institutions and structures, then it just makes the meaning-making process much more complex and complicated for Black youth. I always like to clarify that the take-home message is that not that Black youth, all Black youth have low self-esteem or they feel bad about themselves because, of the existence of racism. There's much to be celebrated about having a strong Black identity. But the challenges that go into having to push back against a lot of the negative, explicit and implicit messages that youth encounter on a regular basis, can make it a little bit more taxing to, sort of hold a sense of yourself as feeling prideful about your community identity, and also, not starting to internalize some of the negative messages that, are regularly part of our, everyday experiences. The same goes for agency and exploration. Young people need opportunities to lead and to try things out. But for Black youth, if they are met with discrimination that comes, through implicit and explicit bias from adults like teachers or hiring managers, law enforcement, and other gatekeepers, that can limit opportunities to safely practice agency and to explore. Similarly, for Black youth, all adolescents will make mistakes. We know that's a part of exploration and discovery. It means trying new things and failing and learning from those failures and trying again. But the consequences for Black youth as when we start to look more systemically, often are, much more dire than they are for youth from other groups. So smaller mistakes or even the same kinds of mistakes can have much bigger and more negative consequences. So thinking about, what we know about discipline disparities, for example. So in some ways, the context of racism and anti-Black racism in particular starts to compromise the very central developmental needs that all adolescents have, and can have a particular impact on Black youth and the opportunities that they're afforded. So that's kind of the core starting message of the report. The rest of the report looks at the context that Black youth often spend their time. So peers and social media, family, school, and community. And I'm happy to talk about those as the conversation moves forward.
Thank you. That's a fantastic overview. And thank you for framing these important developmental processes: identity formation, belonging, agency, all important skills and experiences young people need to have, but might be challenged if they are Black youth. Rodney, I'd like to turn to you and ask you how you see this work playing out in the school context in particular. Joanna talked about a variety of contexts where these experiences can play out. But in your role as a senior advisor for Richmond Public Schools, you're trying to help implement the city's anti-racism policy. What does that involve, and how do you address that? We can't hear you, Rodney.
Sorry, I figured I'd have this down by now, but we don't have an official policy yet, but that's intentional. And it's intentional because we're taking our time. We don't want to rush something just to have a piece of paper to say, this is our policy. We want policy that makes sense and that is guided by talking to all stakeholders, whether it be teachers, community, and even the students itself. And so we're in the process of developing that policy. And it's going to be a two-year process at least, because we want everyone at the table with a voice in this process, the same way we did when we developed our strategic plan. But the reality is, our school systems are not welcoming to Black youth. We can, sugarcoat it and dance around the issue, but it's not built for them. And so one thing we have to do is, number one, we have to acknowledge that. We have to acknowledge that the systems are not built to support our youth. And so once we acknowledge that, okay, the system isn't built to support our youth, what do we do about it? Well, first thing we do is you take an equity audit. You need the data, you need the numbers, you need to understand exactly what are the issues that are plaguing your system. And just like every other school system in Virginia, we have lower literacy rates among Black children. We have over suspension, the disproportionate discipline of Black students. And so now we sort of identified the issues. And then the next thing we have to do, and this is the hardest part about it, we got to hold up that mirror. We got to look in that mirror, and we have to, each teacher, each staff member has to ask themselves, am I contributing to the problem, or am I working to solve the problem? And that is the hard part, when you have to look in that mirror and you have to have those honest conversations, and sometimes you're not going to like the answers. And one of the things we've been doing with the staff is just having those conversations, self-reflection. Is your classroom welcoming to Black students? Are you teaching from an anti-racist lens? Are you going out of your way? First of all, do you believe all Black children can learn? Because the studies show that is not the case, And so we're having those conversations. We started off with bi-weekly professional developments, and we started asking those questions, talking about microaggressions. How does it show up in our practices, our pedagogy? And then we started having deeper questions, how is it showing up with Black boys? We had a professional development last year where we watched the film Black Boys Film, and we had all of our, quite a few, stakeholders on the panel to talk about how it shows up with our students. Then next we did push out first, which is the criminalization of Black girls. And we started having these conversations among staff, because the number one issue when people talk about how to make schools better is you say, oh, what's wrong with the school, with the children? How do we work with the children? It's not what's wrong with the children. Children only respond to the obstacles and things that adults put in front of them. And so we as an adult, we have to say, what is wrong with us? What are we doing wrong that our kids are not experiencing success, not getting the outcomes that they desire? And so that's what's really, really important. Start having those conversations about what is in front of you. What do you need to do? How does it come across every single day in every practice in the division? And so that's where we are now. It's just self-exam. We got the numbers, we're looking at that. Now we're starting to look at ourselves and how we can be better. Then we got to engage our students and our families and start having those conversations, because that's when real change take place. When the whole community, and when we empower those Black boys and Black girls at the, they can sit at the table with the superintendent, the mayor, everybody, that's when you get real change. And so this policy is going to take a while to develop, because we're going to examine, we're going to, look under every rock, overturn every stone, because we want every stakeholder to have a seat at the table while we make this policy.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Rodney, to really talk about how we have to shift the conversation from what's going on with the students to what are the systems and practices that are causing the results that we're seeing. So thank you for the way you are trying to thoughtfully lead the system forward in changing this conversation. Kofi, I'd like to turn to you as a young person who is trying to navigate these experiences. I'd love to hear you talk about what you took away from the report and how you see some of these issues playing out in your own personal experiences.
In my own personal experiences, I see the issues playing out similarly to how Ronnie and Joanna talked about them, with like the overdiscipline of Black students, low and negative expectations from teachers of Black students, which then becomes internalized by the students themselves, thinking they can't succeed. And so that mindset is something that, as a Black Student Union, which is a group we started at our school, we're trying to combat, to aid people and empower them to feel that they can go on to succeed. And also things like ignorant comments from students, just privileged comments, and teachers not seeing how those affect the few Black students that may be in their class, and then them also saying those comments themselves, and having like an all-white administrative staff or all-white department heads and things like that makes it more challenging to then report those incidents to teachers, because you feel like, what if they don't really understand, or what if they don't see it the way I see it, and things like that. So a lot of these things get swept under the rug and just get passed off as just like regular behavior to Black children, which is something that we unfortunately always experience. And I'd say that it's just normal school behavior at this point, which shouldn't be normalized. So when we have like discussions about race and racism and things like that, oftentimes things get just talked about as like things that happened at the time. Like if we're talking about the civil rights era, those are just things of the time, not critically analyzing the events that happen and how they currently affect us. And a lot of teachers just pass over that as just, it happened back then.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Kofi. It has been really helpful to explore all the challenges that this report lifts up from a variety of perspectives. I'd like to turn to some of the recommendations in the report, and I'll start with you, Joanna. One of the takeaways, or one of the recommendations, is that we increase critical consciousness and acknowledge structural injustices as a part of adolescents' education, and that by doing this, we can increase their interest and participation in civic engagement. It seemed like a really amazing virtuous cycle you were recommending. Talk more about what is critical consciousness and what does it look like in practice for young people?
Sure. So I think we're talking really about the skills to recognize, analyze in order to eventually disrupt issues of oppression and injustice. And that is, when we think about like school and the function of school, one of the functions of school is to help students build critical thinking skills. So critical consciousness in some ways is a critical thinking skill. It's about the ability to have the skill to understand the complexities of an issue like racism, for example, as something that has a deep historical context, as something that is much beyond just whether, one person says a discriminatory comment. It's really not just about interpersonal interactions. So it's about the ability to recognize that racism is structural, it's multi-layered, because having the ability to sort of bring that analytic lens then says, okay, now what are some of the ways in which we can disrupt this, systemic institution, if you will. And I heard Kofi just talk about that in their own experiences of, in some ways, what Kofi is doing with her peers is they are fostering their own set of critical consciousness skills. Unfortunately, it doesn't sound like there are spaces in which the school is, contributing to the development of that sort of critical analysis lens. And one of Kofi's remarks about schools often present issues of race and racism through a historical framework where all students are left with is then the sense that, oh, this happened in the past. And, they don't have a sense of how it's connected to present day experiences. In my own research, I've talked to a lot of middle school students about what they've learned about race in school. And I would say, aside from those kids who say nothing, which is a common answer, many of them say, well, I've learned that racism was a problem in the past, or they'll mention something like slavery, maybe civil rights, but it's not a problem anymore. So that's the lack of having kind of these critical skills to think about issues of, racial injustice and other forms of oppression. The other piece I'll say about it, so really it's about a critical tool for recognizing and then analyzing oppression, and students need that in order to then think about ways to disrupt it. And adolescence is a critical time for fostering these skills because young people have the capacity to think on this complex and abstract level. It's also, frankly, a time of deep creativity for our young people when we give them the chance to think about then solutions and problem solving. They in some ways are, a really essential tool for helping all of us collectively make change. But the one little asterisk that I'll add is that this in some ways is student focused. So it's about providing students with the skills of critical analysis. But we don't want to be relying on students to be the disruptors of racist systems. So we need to be fostering those skills among our students so that they are, able to bring them into their, academic experiences and their outside labs. But also we need to be doing the kind of work that Rodney talked about in terms of policy changes and institutional changes, system-wide changes across the education system. So we need to be doing sort of this both and approach, supporting individual students with this capacity while we're also working on systemic change.
Joanne, in the report, it seemed like you went a step further in the conversation about civic engagement, that it wasn't just this building of a critical analytical understanding of the issue, but that there was something healing about young people then translating that knowledge into service for others or positive change. Can you go further and talk about this civic engagement part of the work?
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up. And it goes right back to where I started with core sort of necessary processes and experiences of adolescence. If you have the opportunity to contribute to your community through civic engagement and other forms of community activism, that then feeds your sense of self, your sense of identity, your sense of agency. You're feeling, again, agentic, opportunities to explore and try things out. To be viewed as a leader and to be viewed as an agent of change. All of those are critical to meeting, the core needs of adolescents. And also they, in some ways benefit entire communities when young people are supported in spaces where they're able to make this kind of contribution. So there are multiple benefits. And historically, it's been out of school spaces, youth development programs and other sort of community activism programs where youth have really been put in a position to kind of lead on this community activism. But I think, in some schools are doing this more and more, but schools can become a space where we're fostering those kinds of skills and then giving students an opportunity to put them into practice, which then feeds back into their, their core developmental needs.
Thank you. Kofi, I'd like to turn to you and ask if you have seen examples of this critical consciousness in your classrooms. And if so, what did it look like? If not, what would you like to see? And how have you turned these experiences into ideas and action in your school or in your life?
I wouldn't say I've successfully seen this critical consciousness in the classroom. I've sat in on board meetings or department meetings where they talk about it. They talk about the things that they're trying to implement, the guides that they give to teachers. But from the teachers, what we're hearing is that there's no guidance. We don't know how to do it in these classrooms or in certain subject areas. And so things just don't get talked about. Government is a required 12th grade class to take. So I do hear these conversations more. We talk about it. There'll be like racism is happening now, systemic oppression. They toss around these words, but discussion and critical analysis doesn't come of it because it's such a polarizing topic that has now become political, which isn't something you should talk about in schools. People just acknowledge it as fact, but don't have conversations about it, are scared to share opinions, are scared to really get at the meat and heart of the issues and work together to find solutions. And something that I'd like to see is more guidance for teachers or just conversations with teachers, them analyzing their teaching strategies and things like that, but also getting help on how to implement some of this work that I know is happening behind the scenes, how to actually get it into the classroom where the students are at. Because if we're hearing that they're having these conversations or having these guides or sending these things to teachers, we're not seeing it in the classroom. So how do we get from that point to actually seeing the work being done in the classrooms with the students? And with my work on the BSU last year, a big project that we did was gathering data about the rates of diversity in high-level classes. We all know the numbers, but we went through a pretty scientific process of actually gathering the data so we can present that information with accurate numbers. And we interviewed teachers, parents, students, administration, some of the stakeholders in solving this issue to try to find out their experiences with the issue and what they see as solutions to the problem. And so we're currently working with our administration to implement some of the solutions that we came up with, and also just brainstorm and empower more members and young Black students to be the change that they want to see. And that was a big change that we wanted to see in our school system right now.
You mentioned that you were a part of starting the Black Student Union. Could you talk about how that came about and what it felt like to be a part of bringing together people to address some of these issues?
Definitely. So my sophomore year was just a group of Black students, and we were just like, we need to form a club and a safe space for us to just be authentically Black and be our Black selves. And we got with some teachers and they recognized the need for that. And we just sort of started a club. It formed more out of like a social group, but then we realized that there were changes that we were all trying to see in our school and some issues that we wanted to address. And so we were thankful to have supportive teachers and staff and administration to help us implement some of those things and also form a union and empower other students throughout our school.
That's excellent. Well, that certainly seems like a way you've taken action individually and collectively to do some of what Joanna was just talking about, that you're turning your learning into action, and I think can be a great inspiration for your school and your school system to act differently. Rodney, let me turn to you. What are some of the ways you see Richmond working to increase critical consciousness or acknowledge structural injustices at the school level or school system level?
Thank you. First, I just want to acknowledge Kofi's just honesty. You know, I really love that. It's just so honest, and it's true, because she mentioned that teachers said they need examples from administrators and policymakers on how to deal with the issues. And I remember earlier this week, I was in the room of future, principals, administrators, and the question came up in the conversation, who was Barbara Johns? Only one person in that room knew who Barbara Johns was. And I was floored by that, because Barbara Johns, she is the Rosa Parks of education in the state of Virginia. And if you're going to lead a school full of, Black students, you need to know who Barbara Johns is and her importance to it. So one thing we have to do is, we as leaders, we have to be able to have those conversations. When principals say we need help, we gotta bring in the experts. We have to bring in the people who can help train our principals to have the skills to address these issues. But then also it's really about building critical consciousness within the school system, within our students, because one of the things we did was when we got our federal stimulus funds, a very, very large, significant portion of that goes strictly to our literacy plan. Because there's a saying that the revolution will be literate. We're going to teach our kids how to read. We're going to give them the skills they need so that they can interpret, analyze, and take down the system themselves. And then also with that, we created a real Richmond history course. This was even before, there was the nationwide ask for, more culturally relevant history, where we teach the students the history of Richmond. It was developed by our teachers in collaboration with historical societies and folks in Richmond, so that our students can learn the real history of the city of Richmond to help develop that critical consciousness. Our new curriculums also, there's a focus on social justice as well as part of our literacy plan. But then also we did the other things. One, we collaborated with community partners and our students, and we created a new student code of conduct. We know that a lot of times that the over-discipline disparities that exist amongst our Black students are because our principals are tied, hands are tied by, I'll say it, just a racist code of conduct. And so we brought in Rise for Youth and other organizations and the ACLU and said, hey, look at our code of conduct and tell us what's wrong. And then we made changes and we recommended to the school board, and it was approved by the school board. And so we now have a much fairer code of conduct. We're also reimagining the roles of school resource officers. We're putting more restorative justice programs. Your job is not to arrest. Your job is to, do some restorative justice. Your job is to get some conflict resolution. Your job is to make students feel safe in school, because the reality is when Black students see police officers, that whole feeling of safety goes out the window, because most likely their interactions with the police have been harmful. So we're going to reimagine the roles of our school resource officers, of our school security staff, so that they're solving problems rather than just responding to problems. They're being proactive rather than reactive. And that's really important as far as keeping our students in school. And then, of course, we're engaging the community. We reorganized our engagement office to where we have community hubs around the city where parents, students, anybody can come to and just have conversations. We're giving them the social services they need. We're attacking the whole child by bringing in the family. We know in the reports, it talks about the importance of family and community and setting up our Black youth for success. And so we're bringing them to the table. We established our Brothers United mentoring program to provide extra mentoring, positive role models for our youth. We have that in most of our elementary schools. You see my background, RVA Men Teach. That is a program that our community said we need more Black and brown male teachers in our school district. And so this is a program we've created to support to our Black and brown male teachers, to recruit more Black and brown male teachers. So it's really, really doing what the community says, opening it up, saying, hey, what do we need? Inviting everybody to the table and letting the students speak, because that's who we serve. We're in the customer service business, and the students are our customers, and the parents are our customers. So we're going to bring them to the table, and we're going to say, is this what you need? Because we know we need more Black and brown teachers. Kofi will definitely attest to this. How she said when she said that the majority of people who made the decisions in the school were not the same race as her. Our goal is to make sure that all of our schools match the socioeconomic and the racial background of our students. And so our district has done a lot, but there's still more to do. There's always more to do. We're going to go out this year. We're going to talk to our students. We're going to have Black boys films panels with our young men, push out panels with our young women, because we want to empower them to speak their truth. And when they speak their truth, us as adults, we have to listen. But more importantly, we have to react, and we have to put in policies in place that help uplift their critical consciousness.
Thank you so much. Those are such practical and powerful ways that you are leading Richmond to better serve and support young people and to hear directly from them and their families what they need. We are getting quite a few questions in the chat, so I want to turn now to some of the questions that are being posed. I'll ask that we keep answers fairly short so that we can get through as many of these as possible. So the first question is about, there are two that are about really fostering resilience in Black adolescents when they've suffered fatigue and continued racist and prejudiced comments and exposure to discrimination and microaggressions. A similar question asks about creating psychological safety for young people. Does anyone have thoughts on how to support young people, foster resilience in them as they are navigating these environments?
I can jump in with just a couple of ideas. And Kofi, you kind of demonstrated what this was like for you, but thinking about creating affirming spaces where Black youth can be, as Kofi said, like authentically Black, be around each other without having their identities questioned or invalidated. That is really important, with the recognition that in some ways being Black in America, it's hard not for race to be salient because Black youth get racialized by everybody. But we also should recognize that Black youth as individuals have multidimensional identities. Being Black is only one part of our identities. And so helping to connect Black youth to their other interests rather than making assumptions about how central and important, race is to their identity is critical as well. In educational spaces, teachers can do this by asking young people, what are some things that are important to you about your life, and affirming their values that go beyond just a single dimension of their identity. Teachers looking for specific tools. There's a resource called Along. I think along.org is the website that has a whole set of questions that teachers can ask to students and create sort of an interactive journal in order to foster those relationships. So getting to know your students individually, in addition to creating those kinds of affirming experiences within the school building, I think those are two critical ways that we can support identities.
That's great. Anyone else want to offer anything? You want to offer something, Rodney?
Yeah, I think one way we can teach resilience in our students is by teaching them the real history, going back and showing this is what we have gone through, what we can do, but not just from a traumatic point of view. A friend of mine said, about the 1619 project. It says great project, but if you're starting with 1619, you're wrong. Because if you start with slavery, then everything's going to seem like progress. No, let's go back to Africa. Let's go back to the first man on this planet, and let's have those conversations about what we built, what we had, and how that was basically destroyed. But we have the authenticity, we have the ability to rebuild. I think that's more of an inspirational story. And so I think a lot can be done by just teaching real history and having honest conversation. Even if that does upset some people, we have to, as educators, be brave and empower our students so that they can feel resilient. I mean, how do we expect our students to stand up to a system and challenge it if we're afraid to just stand up in front of them and teach them the real history and what they need to know to get by?
Thank you. Kofi, you want to offer something?
In addition to that, teaching real history, but intersecting other parts of identity, as Joanna mentioned, as like gender diversity or sexual orientation diversity, different diverse cultures within the continent of Africa and things like that. And also, I think when dealing with resilience from fatigue of discrimination, having adequate and free mental health resources for Black students especially is really important to make sure that we are mentally able to continue to endure some of this, which is unfortunately what we have to do, but be able to power through, push through, and rise above and be empowered in all of these things.
Excellent advice. Thank you to all of you for those answers. A next question is about the intersection of anti-Black racism and an academic performance. And so the question is there an intersection between the impact of anti-Black racism and the effect of academic failure in being held back on adolescents? And how do we consider the overlapping systems that are harming adolescent development in order to strategically support Black students? maybe Rodney or Joanna, do you either of you want to talk about any intersection between this anti-Black racism and academic success? I think, Joanna, you might have mentioned this as we were getting started.
When I think about that, I think it's just confronting your bias. You know, in education, we have that bias, and a lot of people don't want to believe it. You know, and so a lot of it comes from, number one, I tell teachers, do you believe that Black students can learn? You know, and that may sound like a simple question, but the reality is when you pull out the reports, when you pull out, you know, the research, a lot of our teachers don't believe that our Black students can be successful. And so that's why I go back to say, you got to hold up that mirror and you have to ask those questions. You know, and then when we look at the performance of our students, are we uplifting our Black students the same way we're uplifting our other students? You know, the numbers say no, because we know that, you know, a Black student with the same grades, same socioeconomic background as a white student is half as likely to get into gifted programs. Where does that come from? That comes from the system not recognizing that brilliance, not promoting that brilliance. And so it really involves us, number one, doing the research. You know, I think a lot of people, the research makes people uncomfortable. When you get into adultification bias, when you get into the intellectual bias, when you get to all those things and put it in people's face, it makes them uncomfortable, especially when you consider the demographics of our profession and that 80% of our educators in this country are white. And when they see those numbers that say, oh, you don't believe in African-American students or Black students, then they get uptight. They don't want to deal with it. But the reality is, this is the research. This is the truth. A fact is a fact. And so we have to now acknowledge that fact, but then also confront our bias and what are we doing in the classroom that doesn't create a successful environment for our Black students. You know, and like I said, that's the hard part, is getting people to look in that mirror and having those honest conversations. But we're going to have, you know, whether you want to have them or not, we are going to have them, because we know that that's what's important and that's what's necessary for our Black students to be successful.
Okay. Joanna, did you want to add anything or talk about other contexts young people are navigating, not just schools, but how we consider these overlapping systems young people have to navigate and seek support from?
Yeah, well, in some ways, the processes are the same. And I think that question that Rodney asked, like, do you think your Black students, you know, are capable of learning? Like, there's nothing wrong with Black children or Black youth. And I think starting from there forces us to question, well, why then are we seeing such disparate outcomes and disparate opportunities? But across systems, those disparities are very persistent. We need to think about intersections too, of things like race and class, for example. We know that Black students tend to be disproportionately represented in high poverty schools. And then this starts to, you know, kind of repeat a cycle. If there are inequitable opportunities, then we see inequitable outcomes that usually, you know, leave Black students kind of on the short end of the stick. And then that reinforces all of these implicit biases that we have about Black students and their abilities. So I think we have, you know, as a society, a tendency to then generalize in the ways that we racialize Black youth. All of those stereotypes and biases inform our, you know, our lens. And so whether you're in the justice system or child welfare or health or education, we're all exposed to those biases, and we need to start asking the critical questions that Rodney asked as adults who are in regular contact with youth, to think about what we can do. We all hold some individual power to make change at that micro level. What can we do to start recognizing those biases and change them, while we're also thinking about how might we, you know, take a critical look at our policies and practices across these systems. I'll mention the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine a couple of years ago put a report out called The Promise of Adolescence, Realizing Opportunity for All Youth. In that report, which is freely available online, we address some of these disparities across systems and how they impact adolescents and adolescents from racially and ethnically minoritized groups in particular.
Great, thank you. Well, I'd like to ask how this work looks different in schools where there are few or no Black students versus schools where the opposite is true? Does this work have the same importance in spaces where Black students aren't present? Kofi, maybe I'll start with you. I don't know what the demographics are of your school, but maybe you can start and talk about what you think might be different in different demographic situations.
I think in demographic situations where there are few to none Black students, the work is even more important in exposing children to diverse backgrounds and cultures and teaching them accurate histories, because oftentimes they're not able to form those opinions or have that exposure directly with contact with different races, cultures, ethnicities, and such. So teaching them about that and exposing them that at a young age is even more important. And my school personally is pretty racially diverse, but as you move to higher level classes, which are the classes that I mostly take, it's few to none. And so I think empowering the few students that you do have is also equally as important.
Hey, thank you. Joanna or Rodney, what do you think the prospects of this work are given the demographics of a school?
I think I agree with Kofi that it becomes just as, if not even more important. And I'll speak now about all youth. We really need to, again, give all youth the capacity to think critically and do critical analysis, but also give them the tools to be able to talk about race and racism without, without the concern and the fear of saying the wrong thing. Many of the middle school students that I talked to were in relatively, racially diverse and racially and ethnically diverse schools. And so many of them talked about, like, if I make an observation that has something to do with race, then I might be perceived as racist by, my peers or somebody else. So I'm just, I'm going to draw my own conclusions, which may be based on complete misperceptions, and I'm never going to talk about it. So adolescents in particular are making meaning of all of the experiences that they have throughout the day. A lot of the young people in middle school that we talked to were making meaning based on what they thought was happening with peers in their school. They were drawing conclusions based on these, social and subjective interactions, and there was never a formal space for them to have conversations about these things. They didn't have the words to talk about race, and instead they felt like, sort of as Kofi was saying earlier, this isn't an appropriate topic to talk about in school. For those few students where there was stronger support from home, they were better able to sort of think critically about issues of injustice in their school, regardless of their racial and ethnic background, and weren't as quick to jump to sort of inaccurate conclusions about what was going on. So I do think it's important to foster this deep understanding and these skills, regardless of the school context.
Rodney, I'm sure Richmond has a wide variety of different kinds of schools. Are you approaching this work differently in different schools?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, as a teacher, we always talk differentiation. No school is going to have, the same issue. So you have to differentiate your response to different schools. But to me, I think one of the biggest ways we can solve these issues, and of course, I'm on my pedestal because this is my thing, is we need more diversity in the teaching profession. Everyone benefits from more diversity. We talk about the benefits that Black children get from having more diverse, and I could quote studies for days and days that talks about the benefits of that, but we rarely talk about the benefits to white children to getting more diverse teachers. Those kids who have Black teachers, number one, they're more likely to engage in those types of conversations because they've had conversations, they've developed relationships with people who defy those stereotypes. So they're more likely to feel comfortable having that conversation. But more importantly, it's just somebody who breaks down those walls. We live in a very, very segregated country. And the reality is a lot of those white students who go to those white schools, they don't see Black people. They don't see Black people. Those Black teachers are the chance for them to see, to humanize, to counteract all the negative stereotypes that they receive from the media, from their family about Black people. And then also school divisions have to make sure you don't just go get Black teachers, you then have to support and uplift them, because if you don't support and uplift them, they're just going to leave and you're going to end up in the same situation you were, before they got there, but with someone out there spreading even more information about how racist your system is. And so we must hire more Black teachers, we must support more Black teachers, and we must create spaces for Black students in schools that are better, that says teaching is an option for you. Because one thing I always say, no Black student wants to go back to their scene of their trauma as a career field. And so we really have to start having those conversations about how do we get more Black teachers? How do we diversify the pipeline? Because in the end, all of our students, Black and white, benefit from having Black teachers, Black principals, Black counselors, Black superintendents. And then when we get them, we must support them in the work that they do, because like I said, everyone benefits from diversity.
Thank you. Well, I think this might be our last question, and it's really about the moment. I started this conversation talking about the racial reckoning that the country is going to. And so it seems like we've got an openness and maybe a unique opportunity to try different things and to maybe make some significant progress on these issues. And so the last question I'll pose is really about how do we take advantage of the current attention on the personal, academic, and professional impacts of racism to really help our students succeed. And I'll ask each of you to talk about what this moment means to you and how it's impacting your work. I'd love to give Kofi the last word. So Joanna, I'll start with you and then go to Rodney and end with Kofi.
Sure. So I consider myself to be an optimistic person. And I like to think about, opportunities that moments like this do afford us. Of course, these moments also come with pushback, with every sort of progress that we're moving forward. There's people who are saying, no, that is antithetical to my own beliefs. Kofi mentioned earlier the way in which, discussions about race and critical consciousness have become very politicized. I know there was questions about, all of the pushback that's happening in some states around what schools can and cannot talk about. But I do think there are opportunities, and that in my experience, when I was at University of Virginia, I was training pre-service teachers who wanted to be in middle schools and high schools. And increasingly over the years that I was there, up until 2020, they were really wanting to engage in these topics, and they were really wanting skills to be able to go into their school buildings and think through the lens of anti-racism and racial justice. And that changed. I was there from 2008 to 2020. 2008, for about a good 5 to 7 years, that was not what I heard from pre-service teachers. But it started to shift. It happened, there were monumental shifts that happened in Charlottesville in 2017, as we all know. So I think when we think about our educators and their desire to be, building up their students and helping their students learn, we have a great opportunity to think about capitalizing on their hunger for the kinds of tools that will help them to do this better, recognizing that, most teachers go into the field because they care deeply about students and about issues of equity and justice, but we need to then give them the tools to do that work. And it wouldn't be me if I didn't also say that the promise that is held within adolescents themselves to lead and for us to follow their example on capitalizing on this moment. We see it nationally with, high levels of youth activism. So we need to be watching closely and taking some lessons from our young people as well.
Thank you. Rodney?
I think right now we're at a critical moment. We made progress. Now we're in the middle of the pushback, and right now it is a time of where do you stand? Everybody talked a good game in 2020, but now here comes the pushback in 2021. Are you still talking that game? Are you still moving forward, or has the pushback given you pause? It's not a time to pause in this work. It's a time to keep going, because the pushback has showed us that this is the work that's important, because we're getting the anti-CRT folks, the anti-mask folks, all of this it's all in the same pot, and it's all coming at us right now. And so it's sort of like an anti-intellectual movement. And so where do you stand? Are you going to stand firm and be an ally or accomplice or co-conspirator, or are you going to fold to the pressure? And I think right now what we as Black people have to do is we have to take note of who folds and who keeps doing the work, because those are the people who we have to ally ourselves with. Those who are going to keep pushing, those who are going to say, we don't have time for this foolishness, because the future of our kids is what's at play. Because trust me, the kids are noticing. The kids notice who said something last year, or more importantly, the kids notice who didn't say something last year. You know, to quote Dr. Kende, you're either a racist or an anti-racist. And we're hitting a point where, you know, the racists are becoming more bold. And so the anti-racists, you can't sit on the sideline while this is going. You have to stand up, and you have to fight for Black students. You have to fight for brown students. You have to fight for the intersectionality of all students, because it's not a game, you know, and kids' futures are at play. So we need to step up right now, and this is a pivotal moment, not only in just education, but in our country. And so history is going to judge you by what you did during this time period.
Thank you. I've got 1 minute. Kofi, could you
sorry,
close us out? That's okay. Kofi, tell us what this moment means to you.
This is a critical moment, as everyone said, and I feel like as Black people and Black youth specifically, we have to do our best to take care of ourselves first, so that then we can go into this harder fight and really work towards the change that we need to see and fight against the pushback that we're getting, because this is going to be a long and hard-fought battle, but we will overcome and rise as we always do. So we just have to really make sure that we're taking care of ourselves and coming together, allying with the right people to get the job done.
That's the note I wanted to close on. Thank you, all three of you, for an amazing conversation. And I hope everyone explores this report to understand the issues and the opportunities more clearly. Back to you, Lucy.
Thank you so much to all of you. This has been such an amazing conversation. We are really looking forward as a webinar series to continue talking about this impact of racism, this impact of prejudice, this impact of just having ideas around what people experience based on kind of their attributes, and particularly as we start exploring some more specific areas and intersections, including students with disabilities. So this has been a really great conversation, and I think just the start of some larger work. So I really appreciate all of y'all being here with us. I would like to also thank all of you that attended. We really appreciated having you with us today. We have a few additional webinars coming up. So we hope that you will join us for one or all of these. We also, when you close your window, will have a survey that pops up. We ask that you take it so that we can continuously improve to better serve you. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you on our next Race and Ed webinar. Thanks so much.